So on corporate social responsibility, my problems are from the sort of Milton Friedman side of the equation. It focuses too much on just business and not enough on all the stakeholders. No company can exist by just focusing on the shareholders. First of all, there are creditors on the business side. You have to pay a lot of attention to them, and the tension between the creditors and the shareholders can be severe. You've got to worry about your employees, and I mentioned your customers, suppliers, your communities, the media, the politicians, what have you. No company can ignore all these different constituencies except at their peril. And so the sort of the pure, and maybe it's not even fair to Friedman, but sort of the pure, the business of business approach is highly unrealistic in terms of how global companies have to work. At the other end of the spectrum, and I'm going to sort of probably perhaps unfairly characterize the CSR people. Number one, they don't talk about economic performance. And corporations are not charitable organizations, they're business organizations, and they have to function as outstanding businesses. GE is the only company that has been the Dow Jones Industrial Average since its inception. It's the only company left. It has managed over more than a century to be a highly successful business organization. It and Westinghouse were in exactly the same place when Jack Welch took over in the year 1981. Westinghouse disappeared. It's about leadership. It's about successful business. It's about making the right choices, whether it's cost cutting at one place so you can invest in technology somewhere else. So there's got to be high performance. And with all due respect, I think often CSR advocates don't really understand or pay enough, give enough weight to that part of it. A second part is that I don't think they give enough attention to how it has to sort of be integrated into business. It's got to make some business sense. Now, as I said, enlightened self-interest is a pretty broad standard, and there's lots of things that you can do that the CSR folks would say were good, but it really has to make business sense in the way that I've talked about, or it's just philanthropy, and I really do put philanthropy as sort of a small part of what corporations are really going to do. It's so much better if it is really part of their business plan, their business operations, and something that they believe in from a business matter as opposed to just a pure philanthropic matter. And the last thing, and this is a problem for business too, and we're seeing it absolutely in the crisis that we sort of are all punching our BlackBerries on while you're having lunch, is public policy. Often the CSR advocates are not able to be successful in the legislatures, and so they come to the corporations and they say, please do this or please do that. And it's fine to take ethical steps beyond what the law requires voluntarily as a company. But there are times when it may be too expensive, when basically it's not competitive. If GE had to pay for all its Superfund sites, which is about $400 million a year, that would not be competitive. But if everyone's required to do it, then it is competitive because we can do it, comply with the law, and maybe do it more efficiently and at less cost than our competitors. There are things called social goods, for all of you who are economic types, or public goods, where basically the individual firm shouldn't pay for them, the society should pay for them. And one of the things I think the CSR advocates sometimes miss, and it'll be interesting as you have the discussion for the rest of this period, are these problems that should be solved by companies, or are they really problems that should be solved by the governments? And we ought to basically be paying through the tax system, not through sort of corporate revenues or profits. And that is a very, very profound question, which I don't think the CSR people always look at, sort of where is that line between what is it reasonable to expect a company to do and what really should be done by society. And at the same time, I think that's also true of corporate leaders. That they think often very defensively, don't do this, don't hurt me, it's going to hurt profits, as opposed to saying, what do we need for a strong society? A strong society is going to advantage us, whether it's education and training, to take sort of the cliche of the day, that we've got to improve a classic public good, that for America to stay competitive and innovative, we have to improve education and training. We have to improve infrastructure. But we also have to have some kinds of regulation, as I think most everyone in this room would say, we are going to have, and maybe should have, some kind of financial regulation after 10 years of deregulation, where I'm sad to say, I think greed overwhelmed discipline, and we're suffering not just the consequences of one firm, but we are suffering systemic breakdown in our whole financial system because of that. So I have this view that I think I congratulate Steve and I congratulate all of you. I think that global citizenship, as opposed to corporate social responsibility, is the right way to think about the role of business in society. with those three elements: high performance, strict adherence to the spirit and letter of the rules, and taking ethical steps beyond what the rules require. I thank you for your attention, and I hope you have a wonderful conference. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. Ben, sorry. Can you take a question? Or two? Yeah. I think you can tell why I thought it would be so important to have Ben be a part of this conversation today. One of my beliefs, Ben, is that the rise of the CSR movement in part is a whole debate about how companies should price externalities. How much should they internalize economic externalities? How much should they cope with political and social externalities outside? One of the things people say to us is, I'm honest and fair, and I'm investing in X, Y, or Z country, and I know my competitor is doing some kind of gifts or bribes or whatever, or things like that. Do you have a rule of thumb for companies in terms of how much they should try and improve the external environment?
Yes.
Ethical environment in which they operate?
That's what I tried to end with, was that companies should be concerned about public policy because the cost of doing something voluntary themselves made it non-competitive.
But how do you price that?
And let me give you an example. And I think, again, some of this is not susceptible to the fine-grained economic analysis. Let me give two examples. We did adopt a program at GE of ethical sourcing where we have literally tens of billions of dollars overseas, but we insisted that all the suppliers, in addition to meeting quality and technical requirements, no child labor, no prison labor, they complied with the local laws about environment. They basically had decent working conditions and decent pay and decent living conditions if they housed people. And we decided on that we weren't going to try to get a law passed, even though our competitors might not do it. We had to be there anyway because we were qualifying them on technical and financial dimensions, and that it just made sense for GE, both for our reputation and as defenders of globalization, to not export bad practices. So we were willing to take the cost of doing that, even though our competitors might not. But let's take bribery as another example. I said before, we had a no bribes policy. We have a no bribes policy, although I'm not saying that we don't ever do it, but we have a very strong no bribes policy and program. But at the same time, there was a fundamental unfairness about going to Indonesia and trying to sell airplanes and basically have Airbus bribe or Rolls-Royce, who is our competitor because we make engines, bribe. So we basically I started doing this in the Reagan administration where there was a question about whether to weaken the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and I said no. Corruption is per se bad for 20 different reasons. We ought to level the laws up, not level them down. And we began a process to get an OECD convention which exists against bribery, where all the OECD countries now have passed laws that are very similar to the U.S., outlawing foreign bribery by their corporations. The law is not being fully implemented. There are lots of questions about how to get it done. But that was a case where we felt that although we were not going to bribe, it was so unfair and that there was such an economic risk that we decided to seek, you will, global public policy to solve the problem. But that's a good example, too, of where you couldn't put a number on it because you could never quite say how much was being bribed. But I used to work, I was fortunate enough to work in the Supreme Court for a Supreme Court justice named Potter Stewart, who said about obscenity, I know it when I see it. It's a very famous remark. Well, on bribery, we knew it when we saw it. We just couldn't quantify it.